some of those stories?
Well, I was wishing I had that list. I had a list I made in sort of in chronological order, but I guess I'll just have to. How much time and how much?
Oh, we have plenty of time, and tape is cheap.
Yeah, well. I'll begin by saying that my military service was not a voluntary service. I was handcuffed by Uncle Sam, who sent me a letter and said greetings, and I was in. And so I enjoyed much of my time in the early part of my Army life. It was difficult because of some people didn't appreciate me. But after a while, they began to see that there was something worthwhile in my life. And I remember the fellows used to go to take showers and stuff like that. They'd all come and hand their wallets to me. And I'd have a whole bunch of them, in my hands. And they trusted me. Well, that's not any glory to me, but what God had wrought in my life and made me what I ought to be. So we began I think it was well over 3 or 4 years of training. And we were in different areas of the states, maneuvering and training, special training and everything like that. And then finally we were called to go overseas. And I believe it was a miracle that we even got overseas, because we were going through the North Atlantic in a convoy. And the waves, it seemed to me, were, well, 2 to 3 times as high as the ship. And they would go right over the ship at many times. And so you can see we were going through some pretty rough water. And the reason for that was to avoid submarines. Submarines couldn't navigate in that kind of territory. And so later on we saw ships. There were one ship that was hit by a submarine and with a torpedo, I suppose, and it was burning. It's on fire. But I believe the Lord brought us through, because we had an aircraft carrier along in our convoy that the rudder broke on it. And so they were no longer able to navigate or to even steer. I don't know how they steered it. Anyway, there was a tanker that was carrying fuel. We had some ships with us that were small ships. They call them corvettes. And they would just circle the whole convoy looking for submarines. And so they had to be refueled constantly. Barney, all right. And so that was the reason for the tanker that was with us. So they towed the other ship. And so we went on, and we I didn't really get sick at that time, but when we finally got over to the coast of Africa and went through the Straits of Gibraltar and headed on to go into France, southern France, Marseille. And so on our way that night, we ran into a storm that was even worse than the one we had in the Atlantic. And at that time, I did get a little sick because of the violence of the ship, the way it was going up and down and turning around, twisting around. And so we got into Marseille, And we had to kind of gather our whole unit together, and that took a few days, took about a week to get us ready to go up to the front. And in the meantime, we were listening to Berlin Sally. And I don't know whether any of you who was listening to this are old enough to remember who Berlin Sally was, but she was a woman that was an American at one time, I believe, but she was she was broadcasting propaganda constantly out of Germany. And so she got on the airwaves, and we were listening to her, and I guess the fellows enjoyed listening to her because of the music and because of the way she talked and things. They'd laugh about it. And so she says, we have a very warm welcome for the 103rd Division. That was our division. And so, but that never did materialize. But anyway, we had enough trouble without her telling us we're going to have more. Then we started toward the front, and we approached an area on the front lines that was supposed to be occupied by another company of 200 and some men. And they must have had an awful time of it, and we missed that awful time they had, because when we went up to relieve the company, our 200 and some men in our company, we had to go through the dark. We had to hold on to a rope to know where we were going. And then when we got approximately in the right place, we had to dig our foxholes and dig in and be ready for whatever was next. But when we relieved this other company, there was only 7 men left out of 200 and some. So you can see what a beating they took. And then we were in there for some time, and I remember getting shelled. We got shelled by their artillery. And I had a young fella that was under my command, and he was a Catholic, and he and I were in the same foxhole together. And I remember praying and talking to him about the Lord too. And so we kind of agreed that we needed help. And I remember them sending us on a short patrol to find out where the enemy was. I think they were just thinking up goofy things to do. So we were heading off to one side and going through woods, and the Germans spotted us. And they had a tank with a 88 millimeter cannon on it that was one of the best weapons between all of the enemy and us. And so they start shooting at us, and we were down it was kind of a hilly place, very sharp, hilly place. So we got down low in a valley-like arrangement, and they were firing over the top of our heads, and I guess they finally quit, so we came back. And so we continued to realize that we needed the Lord to take us through. And so we moved out of there, and I remember when we were first moving along, and we finally came in contact with the enemy. At least we thought we were in contact with the enemy, and they were very close. And so the platoon sergeant, I don't think he remembered all the things he was training us in and the things he told us to do and not to do. And one of them was that you don't go out in the open and let somebody shoot at you. So what did he do? He sent several of our men to go out in the open and approach the sort of a valley below us. And the moment they got out there, some machine gunner opened up and killed the squad leader. And I remember how quick death was. There he was. We went and picked him up, and all he was able to do was utter maybe a couple of words, and his life was gone. Later on, months later, I got a letter from his wife wanting to know what happened and everything, and they wanted the details, which I gave them. And so anyway, we went around, and the platoon sergeant went around. He ran around. There was a machine gunner in a foxhole or with a covering on it, and just a small opening where he was shooting from. And so the platoon sergeant took a grenade and threw it inside of there, and there was no more music coming out of that place. And so we went on, and I'm trying to recall things in chronological order, and it's a little difficult. But anyway, one of the incidents that I think was a great miracle, that God was with us, that he was hearing my wife's prayers and my mother-in-law's prayers and my mother's prayers, and the church, they were all praying for us. And we were going along, and we came to the Siegfried Line. Now, we came to the Maginot Line, which was a line of pillboxes, which were huge. Some of them probably were as large as, well, larger than some of the bigger homes that you know of, and they were all made of concrete. And but the Maginot Line was no protection for the French, because the Germans, they just bypassed it and went clear around and went in from behind them, and then they lost their ability to defend themselves, and they had to give up and get out. And so here we went through there, and there was no incidents at that time. And then we came to the Siegfried Line, which is a little further into Germany, which was a long line of pillboxes too. They were the size of, I don't know. Some of them had something like 4 rooms in them, where you could, and bunks and food supplies for a long time, and ammunition and all kinds of equipment. And so we were coming into the little town right in front of the Siegfried Line. And so we looked up there, and we saw some of the fortifications they had. And we saw what they call dragon teeth. Those were big cement things that were made to tip a tank over if he tried to go through. And then they had a tank, what they call it, a tank trap, in front of their defensive line, and it was a wide opening. I'd say the opening was probably about 16 feet wide by about 12 feet deep. And so no tank could get through there. They'd fall in there and they'd be helpless. So that was their protection. But anyway, we noticed as we were approaching that they managed to throw some artillery at us, and but it wasn't very effective. And one of our tanks, or one of our that was with us, there was a church steeple right near us, and usually the enemy used church steeples for figuring out who's coming and where they're going, and would direct enemy fire on whoever they saw, or artillery. So they, in the process of getting into the town, why the tank fired at the church steeple, and if there'd been anything in it, it was gone. And so there was no way for them to observe us from that thing. And so I remember there was a place that we were going through, and I think this happened even before what I'm talking about now. We were going down a road, and the enemy was in a woods to our right. This was an asphalt road, and somebody was in there, and I think it was only one soldier, probably, and he starts shooting at us. And we were helpless because there was a big hill, like a mountain, almost to our left. We couldn't go nowhere, so there we were. But one of our tanks managed to turn around and open up with his machine guns. They had about 4 or 5 machine guns on the tank that turned around there and could really lay down a lot of bullets and all was quiet after that. I don't know whether they hit anything or anybody, but we kept on going. But anyway, getting back to this little town where we moved into the town and got into a couple of houses. We usually made ourselves unwelcome guests. Sometimes we were welcome. I think yes, we were welcome at this time. And so we got in this one house, and I was surprised to talk to the people in there in the house. And they said that this was an area where it had been through many wars, not just one war, but many of them, including World War I and beyond that. So they were well prepared for any eventual wars coming through their area. And if I remember correctly, this particular house had 3 more basements in it. You go down one, the first basement, second, third. And down in I think it was the 3rd basement down below that is where the family stayed. And it was well made and I guess ventilated and stuff like that. And they even had their cattle on one level and their livestock. And so we were in this house, but I just went down in there to look at what they had down below. That's all I did. We didn't go down there and stay down below. So we were up above, and we were quite, what would I say, disturbed over what we saw we're facing. And I understand the Siegfried Line was made up of these emplacements, which I say are as large as a good-sized house, and they were underground mostly, and there was 15 foot of concrete in the front of them to protect them, and they had a little hole out there through the front where they could fire a gun, and actually it was a cannon, and so. And we knew that they had a lot of barbed wire and probably mines, things that were buried that would explode if you'd step on them. And we were quite worried about this in a way, concerned. And so we were we decided that, well, we were going to have supper, so we had supper there. We fixed our own supper with the people's equipment, stove and dishes and stuff. And so after our supper, we were getting ready to get ready to turn in and sleep, and I gathered all my men together and I said, listen, we're facing something. We need God's help. And I said, we need to pray. And so I led them in prayer, And so that they all appreciated that, I guess. And so we went to bed that night, and our orders were to get up about 5 o'clock in the morning and be in that tank trap I was telling you about, which went across the whole Siegfried line. I mean, it was miles either way. And so we got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I gathered all the men together, and we headed for that tank trap. I had 36 men approximately under me, and they were relying on my guidance and direction. And so we got down in there by a ladder, went down on one side, and I had them all line up side by side. And I said, at the signal, we'll all go over the top. We had ladders all placed along the whole thing to get up over and get into going toward those emplacements. And so I had men with me that had flamethrowers. I don't know whether you know what they are, but they had tanks on their back that were full of liquid oil. And this unit would ignite the oil, and they could shoot it out at a tremendous distance, probably 50 yards or something like that, and it was just liquid fire. If they'd put that into the emplacements over there, it'd be kind of dangerous for the occupants. And then I had fellows with certain, they called it a Bangalore torpedo. It was a long pipe-like explosive. It might have been 6 or 8 feet long. And if we ran into barbed wire, they could lay it right down in the middle of the barbed wire and ignite it, and it would blast the barbed wire open and out of our way. But previous to that, we had some American planes were bombing the area, and they were dropping bombs all over the place in there. And so apparently the bombs had destroyed any mines and tore up the barbed wire and just made it that much easier for us. So anyway, when I was looking at my watch and it said 6 o'clock, that was the time we were supposed to go. And so I put my arms out like this, and I looked down both ways and said, okay, fellas, let's go. And nobody moved. And so I decided, well, I guess I've got to move. I'm what they call a platoon leader, and I'm going to have to lead them. So that's the way it worked. So I started up the ladder, and then everybody else did. And I guess they may have gotten ashamed of themselves if they hadn't. And so we went all over the top, and we met one German soldier in that whole, and by the way, I didn't tell you how they were staggered, maybe say 50, 75 yards apart, these things. And then you go back, and there'd be staggered behind them, and then behind them. And I understand the line was 15 miles, or 9 or 15 miles deep. I think it was 15. I could be wrong on that. In other words, you'd have to keep going through all those emplacements and fight your way in there. And they also had men that were carrying what they call satchel charges, 48 pounds of TNT. And they could place that against the back door. The back door was a steel door and was very vulnerable. You'd have to go down the stairs and put it up against that door, set it off, and it would really play havoc with anybody inside and outside as well. But anyway, we met that one German soldier who was in a little foxhole, apparently left there by the rest of them. And so we began to go to these emplacements, and we opened the door and looked in, and there was all the supplies and all the bunks and all the ammunition and all kinds of stuff, but nobody, no people, no soldiers. And what we found out was that General Patton and his armored group had bypassed this whole Siegfried line and went behind it. And when he started in behind it, the Germans knew it, and they said our emplacements are all facing toward us, and not him and behind him. So their emplacement is just worthless. So they pulled out of there at midnight, and they were gone, and we didn't know that. And so we were going up there, and we were looking into several of the emplacements, and nobody in any of them. And as we were going over a hill, I know I had one of my men was out in front of me, and he was kind of a tough character anyway. And by the way, I lost two of my men when we went on this thing. They disappeared, and I never saw them after that. They had deserted us. And I understand they've done this before. But this one fellow that I was telling you about that's kind of a rough character, he made these two boys dance. And he had a submachine gun, one they call a Tommy gun, it was sort of an old-fashioned kind of a weapon. And but he made them dance out in the street, and I had to get after him and stop it. But they later, like I said, they left us then. They never showed up after that. They must have got back into one of them German towns and got swallowed up in the population. And so what did this tough fella that I was telling you about, he was about 50 yards in front of me. He turned around and he says, "Say, Lieutenant," he says, "God heard our prayer, didn't he?" And I hollered back at him. I said, "He sure did." And the Bible says if the Lord knows your prayers, your requests before you even give them, but he wants you to give them. See, he wants you to voice your need, and then he'll help you. He'll go along with you on whatever problem you got. And if you just keep your mouth shut and be quiet on something, you got something wrong or some problem in life, it may not get exactly solved unless you open up your mouth and ask the Lord's help. And then after we got through there, we went off into another area, and we got put in an area there one time where we were on one side of the river, a river, and the enemy was on the other. And I remember this in a way is really kind of humorous. So we knew the enemy was on the other side of the river, and they had shot at us, but missed us. We were staying in a house, and we had one of those old German soldier helmets with a peak on top, and we had it sitting on a table in the kitchen. And there was a German soldier apparently over there on the other side of the river that spotted it, and he probably thought it was somebody's head. So he fired a bullet, and it went through the window and went right through that helmet. And it would have been one you'd like to have on your mantle at home. But anyway, we were scheduled that night to get into rubber rafts and go across the river and attack the enemy in the dark. And so we didn't think that was a very good idea. But anyway, here they came, and they supplied us with about five rafts. And so we could all get in the rafts and go across the river. And for some reason or another, they'd get in these things and the air would go out of them. And what somebody was doing was sticking their knife or their bayonet, poking a hole in the bottom of it, and it would lose its air. And so these leaky rafts never got to use, and I'm so thankful that we didn't. And but another time that I think was a great miracle that took place, we came into a small German town, and the cities over there, and I would think that they're a lot like they were then. Everybody lived in the city, and if you had a farm, you had a piece of land or whatever it was outside of the city, and you go out there and work your garden or your farm part, then you come back home into the city where you lived. So we went in there, and we started at one end of the little town, and went searching through houses to see if there were any enemy soldiers in there. So this fellow that I said was a friend of mine. We were in the foxhole together. I said that at the beginning, and I had prayed and things like that. We were going. We'd already gotten through the town, the two of us, and we were at the last house in the town, and we thought, well, now this is simple. Nobody in the town at all. But he and I were standing in back of the house, and I'd say we were back probably 150 feet, quite a ways. And we were standing there, and I heard this artillery shell. Both of us heard it coming. And we knew we'd experienced, been bombarded by artillery quite often, in fact, even by our own artillery. And so we knew that this artillery shell had our name on it, our names. I looked up there in the sky, and I don't know whether I said anything or not, but just before the shell hit, we were already carried into the house. There was a barn, like in the back, with an opening, and we were carried in through that door or that opening. It's maybe a garage, more like a garage. And we were carried through the air, and I don't remember going through the air, but we landed on the ground inside of that shed when the shell went off. And so I thought that the Lord was protecting us there. The sequence in just the right order, but anyway, they took place. This same fella that I told you that he and I were good friends, and we were in the foxhole together, and we were in the same outfit, and he was my assistant, and he. My feet get big in there. Eh? So anyway, we were going into a town, and as we were getting there, we came under fire of mortar shells. Now, a mortar is just it's a small explosive shell. It throws shrapnel, and sometimes they're about 3 inches in diameter, and sometimes they're 6 inches in diameter. They're various sizes, and even smaller than that. And anyway, we got under fire, so we had to quickly dig slit trenches, and I never dug a slit trench so quick in all my life as to dig one. And what that is a what do they call? They call a slit trench, they call it your grave, because it's just like the size of a coffin, and you could stick it in it. But anyway, we're protected. Well, the Germans let up on their mortar fire on us, and so then we started to go toward the town, and we got pretty near to the town when they started again. And so we had to we found a ditch that we got in, and there was a culvert there. And I'd say it was about a 4-foot 4 foot high or something like that. So we all crowded in that culvert, and we were safe. And then they stopped again, and then we got out, and I noticed as we were running across to get into that town, we come through a soft area, and there were mortar shells were falling all around us. And what had happened is the mortar shell would sink down in the mud, in the muck, and go off. And its shrapnel effect had no effect on us because it was already in the underground. And so they were explode directly upward, which I'm thankful for. But my friend got hit with a piece of shrapnel from one of those mortar shells, and it knocked him off his feet. He got hit in the chest, right about here someplace. And so here he was laying down, and I had a medical man come up. He was one that treated wounded, and he came up to him, and I looked at him. I was standing there. I said, his name was John. I said, John, can you get up? Because I wanted to get out from under this fire from the mortar shells. And he said, well, he says, I'll try. So he got up, and we all ran in, got into the town, got into a house. And so after we got in the house, he's going to decide whether he got what he had, what kind of wounds he had. So he started taking off his raincoat and his field jacket, and inside of his shirt, he had one of those prayer missiles. I think it was a Catholic prayer missile. You know, they're about that wide, and they go in this pocket here, and they had a steel cover on them. And then the inside reading material was about an inch thick too, you know. So what happened was that big piece of shrapnel, which was a square piece, just about that size and about that thick, hit him right there, and it was embedded in that prayer missile. And that's what knocked him off his feet. And so anyway, he was quite amazed at that. And that certainly, if it had hit him, it'd have been a different story. It would have embedded itself probably in his chest somewhere. And so we got into the town, and I remember the Stars and Stripes. That was a magazine that was passed around through the armies and people who were soldiers and everything, sailors. And they put his story in there about that. And then I'm trying to think of this other one now. So the incident that happened. Well, anyway, yes, my outfit, we were going down a road one day, and we were coming to a town. And the town was that we were getting artillery fire and machine gun fire from the town itself. And the town was kind of high up on a hill. And I suppose the German soldiers could sit in those buildings up there, and they looked like apartment houses or something like that. They could stick a gun out there and shoot, and you wouldn't know it. And the interesting thing about the Germans had what they call smokeless powder, and there was no smoke that came out when you shot. So you had a tough time finding out where that shot's coming from. You hear the shot, the bullets here, I'm going by or whatever. A bullet sounds about the same as the report of the gun when it goes by. There's a loud cracking sound. And so we got behind a tank, and the tank was moving ahead, and some of the fellows were going down the road, and an artillery shell came in there, right on the road, where there was a bunch of our guys were standing there or moving, and there were 2 or 3 got wounded there. one of the squad leaders got a piece of shrapnel hit his collarbone and broke it, I guess. He went to the hospital on that and came back later, and he was by no means ready to get back out there in the action, because once you get wounded, I guess, and you get into some of these things, and a lot of people, it puts fear into them. And he was kind of fearful, shaky. Another fellow that was a real brave character and noisy character in our training, you'd think he knew it all, and and he lost his cool. In fact, he supposedly lost his part of his mind just from the strain, and so he was sent back too, and I never did see him again. And one of the platoon sergeants, he got wounded by that shrapnel. Wasn't too bad, but it was enough to knock him out of there. Another fella got really badly wounded, and he never did see combat again. And to this day, of course, he's dead. He died some time ago, but he had a bad situation there. And so one of the officers came up to me and he said, "Grant," he says, "I guess you're in charge." He said, "Take your men and go around, and we want to try to find out where the enemy is. Draw fire." And of course, nobody likes that. You go out there and let somebody shoot at you to find out where they are. And so I was going up this asphalt road, which swung around to the right, and then it went into town like that. It was sort of a zigzag deal. And they brought in an artillery observer who was separate from our unit, but he would go up there and he would take directions from the company commander as to where they needed to send artillery fire. So they were sending artillery fire on those houses and those buildings up ahead of us. But so I was ordered to take my men and go down the road toward where it made that next turn in the road going into the town. And as we were going down there, I noticed that there was a machine gun was firing. It wasn't ours. And I saw the bullets hitting the pavement up in front of me, and it was moving my direction. And as it moved my direction, I decided it's time to get out of there. So I jumped. I run for the ditch, to jump in the ditch, and as I was jumping, a bullet went through and it hit one of my fingers and created a blood blister. And it went through my gloves. That's how close it was. It went underneath my arm and through the finger of the glove. It hit the tip of my finger, and that stung so all up my arm. I thought I was shot in the arm. So I dove in the ditch, almost head first with my gun and everything else, and got down in there, and and there was two of my men got wounded up ahead. One of them, I never seen him afterwards either. He got a bullet through his arm, and he got one through his leg, and it didn't hit any bones, just went through. And he was laying up on the road up there, and I hollered at him. I said, "You able to get up off that road?" And well, he says, "I'll try." And I think so, but he jumped off and he got into where we were, but he had no bones broken, so he was all right. And he had to go back and go to a hospital, I guess. And another fellow had one bullet just creased his cheek. It made a little cut right on the side of his cheek. That's how close it come to him. A little bit moved over, and all she wrote. And so I was thankful to get out of that one. We lost an officer up there. He got he got in the middle of some of that artillery, or no, I think he got into machine gun fire. They were shooting at him, and he got wounded bad enough to not see him again. And so, but anyway, I might have to come back a little bit to some of the other stories that I realized that God was with me then, because that those bullets from that machine gun could have went through my back, and that'd have been, been not too good. And so there was another time too. We were trying to catch up with the enemy, and we were trying in all kinds of anything that would move, like tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, weasels. A weasel is the kind of vehicle I was in. There were 6 of us in it. And we were up front of everybody. We were the first ones. And so we were coming toward this town, I guess it was, and somebody hollered out, "Krauts ahead." And so he turned this weasel. It was a vehicle that run on track, and it was amphibious, about the size of a Jeep. It could go 40 miles an hour down the road. And so he turned to the left to get off the road a little bit, and we all jumped. And when I jumped, I heard this loud cracking noise. And after I hit the cement, or the asphalt, I noticed my lower part of my leg went one way and I went the other. And so I knew then that I was broke my leg jumping off that weasel. Everybody else jumped and had no problem. I don't know why it was me. I think I know why. And I would say that the Lord may have permitted that to keep me from getting into what was coming later, which I'll tell you about if I don't forget. And so anyway, I was laying on the side of the road. I dragged myself off the road because all the tanks and trucks and soldiers and everything went by me. They went on. And these German soldiers were just surrendering. That's all they were doing. And so anyway, they went by me, these German soldiers, and anyway, they said they would send some vehicle up to pick me up. So they came, and I had been in the medical corps for a while and learned a few things about broken bones and stuff like that, and so they came to pick me up, and I said, "Wait a minute," I said, "you don't want to pick me up now." I said, you got to put a ladder splint on my leg. And that's a wire thing, like they would wrap around your leg, and then they would put bandages around to hold your leg straight. And so they proceeded to go. They said, "Well, we'll have to go back and get one." So they went back to the aid station, got one, and come back. I said, "You're not taking me until you put a ladder splint on that leg." I could have hurt it worse. It was bad enough because, so I went heading toward the aid station on a stretcher. They could put stretchers on one side of those Jeeps. And I felt like $1 million. I felt the war is over for Grant, which it was. And I didn't have to worry what was going on or getting shot at, or in fact, I never had to kill anybody. I never had to shoot anybody. I don't think I ever had to tell anybody to shoot somebody either. So I'm thankful for that. And so I got back to the aid station, and then they want to take us in an ambulance. We have to go to a hospital, and the nearest one was in Reims, France. That's where that great Catholic cathedral is. I think it's Reims. And so they proceeded down some dirt roads going toward that place, out of the way roads, and there were 3 other wounded soldiers in the ambulance with me, and these 2 fellas that were driving the ambulance were doing nothing but jabbering and talking and laughing. They paid no attention to us, and going over those bumps in the road didn't feel good. Didn't feel good on my leg. It didn't feel good on those fellas. They were hollering and carrying on, but these guys, apparently they'd been used to this kind of thing, so they didn't pay much attention. And so they got us into Reims, and I got in there, and I was put in a hospital bed there in the hospital, and I remember there was a captain next to me. I met him. He was in a bed next to me, and he was crying. I mean, he was carrying on like, you know, what he had lost his leg, or he was going to lose it, and I don't know which it was. And so I thought to myself, I think I told him too. I said, well, don't you realize that the war's over for you? You don't have to worry about the war anymore. And he kept on carrying on, and if I'd have been him, I'd have, you know, they did a pretty good job for people that lost a limb in those days. They took care of them, and but I had to be operated on, and then I was sent to England by air, by plane, and got over in England and got in there and closed a couple of more hospitals. See, the war ended while I was in one of the hospitals over there in England, and it ended on May 7th, I think it was. May 7th of, I forget what year. And so I was sent back to the States on a hospital boat, and back up to Chicago, to Vaughan General Hospital, where I finally, my wife came to see me, and I was sure glad to see her.
See the other side of the story.
And so they had their trials while I was gone, but the Lord allowed me to come back, at least still alive, and I might be able to add some more to this. Anyway, at that juncture, they tried to get my leg to heal, and in fact, I was in the hospital, that is under hospital guidance, for 2 years.
2.5 years.
And was it 2.5? And so anyway, that was sort of a vacation time, because I'd sometimes I get 30 days off, and sometimes 60 days, and finally in one of the hospitals I was sent out. We closed that hospital in Vaughan General in Chicago, and went out to Galesburg, Illinois, to a hospital out there, and my leg began to mend, and I was able to put some weight on it. And I continued along, and finally it got pretty well healed. And they had to close that hospital. So I went to Percy Jones General Hospital in Battle Creek, Michigan. And from there, of course, I was I was finally discharged, and I still had a brace on my leg, but they... What's that?
You had a crack here.
Yeah. Anyway, my next assignment was Puerto Rico. So we went by ship into Puerto Rico, and that was quite an experience. My wife and children got seasick. And
He wouldn't even take care of us. He stayed up on deck.
anyway, they were pretty sick. And so we got to Puerto Rico, and I was assigned a group of men in the Henry Barracks, which is in the top of the mountains down there. Beautiful weather. Cool at night, warm in the daytime.
Thought it rained.
Rained every day for 10 minutes at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, something like that, just like clockwork. You'd set your watch, almost set your watch, I should say, be honest with you. But it would rain for 10 minutes, and then in a couple of minutes, you wouldn't even know it rained. And flowers everywhere, and after a while, I got promoted to be the provost marshal of the post. Had an interesting thing happen. Maybe I'd conclude this story. Have I got enough time there? A couple of minutes? Okay. I'll conclude with this little story. We were in the officers' club, and my wife was with me, and they were having I think they had a meal, and then they had bingo. And so we were playing bingo, and everything seemed to be going smoothly and having a little bit of fun. And Mary won the bingo game. And what was her prize but 2 bottles of whiskey? Big, huge quart with a fifth. I guess they call them a fifth. And they come over and set them on the table like that in front of Mary and myself. And then then Mary, she started crying, and she says, I don't drink, and I don't want that. I said, I don't want nothing to do with that kind of stuff. And she says, it's not right. I don't know. She might have said something spiritual. I don't remember what she said at the time. But the base commander, he was a colonel. He and his wife were sitting right across the way from us, and they saw all this. And a strange thing, it gave me favoritism in his sight, and he promoted me, of course, to being the post-provost marshal. And my wife was a good friend of his wife, so that all turned out real good. And I'm sure they never forgot that little incident where my wife says, I think she said, the Lord's not pleased with this, or this is the sinful thing, or whatever. But anyway, they got the message, and I'll conclude with that little story.
On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I cherish the cross, the rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. cross, I will ever be true. Its shame and reproach gladly bear. Then he'll call me someday to my home far away, where his glory forever I'll share. So I'll cherish the cross, your rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown.
Hello, this is Steve coming at you. I would like to point out a few things about Dad's military stories that have stuck with me for all these years. Dad always felt that it was God's will that his leg was broken. When he was in the hospital for England for 1 year, the doctors wanted to amputate his leg, but he wouldn't let them. Dad always said that if his leg wasn't broken, he would have been in the D-Day campaign, and we all know that over 50,000 soldiers died that day. I've always said that if Dad went to D-Day, I would not be here talking to you right now. God always knows what is best. Dad did not say much else about his military career, but did say a little bit about Puerto Rico, where he became provost marshal. From there, he went on to the Korean conflict, where he never saw any combat, but was over his command guarding a base over there also. Alan arrived in Puerto Rico as a baby and did speak Spanish before he learned English. In my research on the 103rd Division, there's all kinds of info on where the division traveled in France and Germany. Dad did go quite a ways into Germany. He did tell me that Patton's command was always in front of the 103rd Division, and Patton's command did go through Bamberg, Germany, before the 103rd. Dad said their job was to clean up, kill, or capture any soldiers left behind. Dad did say he went through Bamberg, Germany, where I was stationed in Germany during my tour of duty in the Army. Small world, isn't it? By the way, I got that letter also. Greetings, you are wanted in the Army. I never really knew my dad until he came home from Korea in the early 50s. I still remember I was playing with my Tonka trucks on the living room floor near the stairs going up at 808 New York Street. I can remember my dad was wearing his military uniform and his arm was full of stripes. He came over and picked me up, and I started to cry, and Mom said, "Don't worry, he's your dad." Over the years, Dad's leg got worse. We hunted together for over 30 years. Last time I went hunting with him, I knew it was going to be my last year. He got to where I'd have to drive him to the stand and clear a path to the ground blind. He had great difficulty walking on uneven ground. That mount I have in my living room was the last deer Dad was able to help me get out of the woods. We used a dolly. Dad would hardly let me help him, though I knew he was having trouble. In conclusion, I would like to say, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May his light shine on you and give you peace. God bless.